All right. Almost there. Oh, no. I don't want it set to private. I want everyone to see this. Public. Go live. Sorry, at first it was set to private, and I don't want it to go private. We want everyone to see this. Sorry, just taking a moment to prepare to stream the live webinar.
No problem.
Sorry, just taking a moment to prepare to stream the... There we are. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our latest episode of ScFi Decrypted. I'm Joy Jackson, and today with me is special guest Jay Dyer.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Jay. Sorry, I have to turn off my YouTube. Sorry about that. It was giving us a little feedback. For those of you watching that are not familiar already with Jay Dyer's work, Jay is known for one of the premier film and philosophy sites on the net, jaysanalysis.com. Gray's graduate work focused on the interplay of film, geopolitics, espionage, and psychological warfare. Jay is a public speaker, lecturer, comedian, and author of the popular title, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, which made it to Amazon's #1 spot in its first month of the release in the film and Hollywood category. Jay is known for his in-depth commentary and satire, and he has appeared on numerous nationally syndicated radio and television shows. Jay is also the co-host and co-creator with Jay Weidner of the TV show Hollywood Decoded on Gaia TV, and has a sequel to his first book, Esoteric Hollywood 2, about to be released this December 1st. Again, welcome, Jay. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I appreciate your sharing my material for so many months or years. I think you've been reading my stuff for a while, so I appreciate all the likes and links and shares.
Oh, thank you. No, I'm definitely a huge fan of your work, and it's the least I felt I could do. Just anything to bring them to you. Really, I think the work that you're doing is unprecedented, honestly, or at least not at the prolific level that you've been doing it. And
well, it's definitely weird, and it's definitely not the norm. So I guess I'll take unprecedented. There have been some people who've done similar types of things, but it is a unique mix. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. And, I was just going to say, I mean, what drew you in to getting into this type of work? I mean, I can clearly see by just taking a glance, even at your website or your YouTube channel, that this must be a labor of love for you.
Yeah, just going back to, stuff that I'm interested in. The internet does provide a way for people who have niche interests to figure out a way to make a living. So that was part of it. Part of it was just intellectual interests, research, stuff that I was into in terms of movies, books, fiction, nonfiction, the stuff I studied in undergrad and grad school. And so it was really a combination of all those things. So a pursuit of the truth as well as a love of the arts. So both of those things combine to draw me into what I do now.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Was there a point where you realized that most of the works of film, and I know you're really into myths and
Mhm.
literature, were more than just stories, if you know what I'm saying?
Hmm. That's a good question. I'm not sure when I noticed it. Probably at a point where I was beginning to read the Bible, actually, because the Bible is full of symbolism. So I not really contemplated the importance or meaning of symbolism until I was trying to decipher this in the way that it's presented in Scripture. So, ironically, that in a roundabout way led me to considering symbology in general, the way it's used in every area of life, linguistics, philosophy, philosophy of signs and symbols, which is semiotics, the way it's used in advertising, the way it's used in art, iconography. You start to realize the symbols are everywhere. So it's just a really fascinating um, philosophical side road you can go down. So as I was studying biblical symbology, I was also doing undergraduate work and studying the idea of symbols themselves, just straight up philosophy and how language works and language theory. So it all kind of goes together, and you start to realize parallels across disciplines. And we live in an era when you're supposed to think of all of these areas as discrete, as disconnected from one another. That's the way modern education is structured after the Prussian education model, compartmentalization. And I'm very much a connecting thinker. Like I connect dots between seemingly different, disparate things. So I'm more of a big picture, holistic thinker. And so probably be the Bible, and then realizing, well, actually, there's a lot of symbolism in movies. And I used to draw a lot when I was younger. I almost went to art school. So if you've taken art classes, you
Mhm.
get introduction to symbolism. I remember taking art appreciation classes. One of my first college classes was art appreciation, and then aesthetics. So you're introduced to symbol theory in terms of the arts, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of beauty. So all of those things are what I guess first raised the question of um, symbols and stories having an importance beyond the surface level, I guess.
Wow. Yeah. No, thank you. I was just going to say it's interesting because I think we're about the same age or generation. And I think,
Probably.
yeah, I think,
I'm
yeah, I was,
I'm 38.
oh, okay. Well, I'm a little older. I'm in my early 40s, but we're close enough.
Mhm.
It was around the time I was in my pre-teens, mid-teens that it was the compartmentalization that I started to recognize
Mhm.
behind everything. I left school pretty early. I did go back and kind of pick and chose what I studied, but it was, I think, being able to break out of the system a little bit.
Mhm.
That kind of, I was kind of a big picture thinker too, and some things to me just intuitively, um, if I looked at them by themselves, didn't make sense. But when I started getting the bigger picture, especially with advertising, some of the more obvious and overt types of symbolism that I was aware of creeping in. And music, I think, was where I first really started
Mhm.
to hone in on it.
That's true.
Um,
Yeah, I forgot about. I mean, I'm a big music fan too, so I can't forget. How obviously lyrics in songs utilize a lot of symbols. So yeah.
well, and even back then, I can remember, if you play a record backwards, you'll hear the. So it's not as if, like you're saying, it's not that it's a new concept to think of symbols and predict programming being placed into art or into
Mhm.
music or mediums.
That's true.
But at the same time, I don't think I started to really see how much it was being put into our media on a mass scale in a
Mhm.
large way until I really discovered your work, or it really just started to pull it all together for me. Um,
Mhm.
I first came to your work through your show on Gaia TV, which was
Okay.
Hollywood Decoded.
Right.
Well, actually, I should say I did first come to your work through the Gaia Network, but it was actually your first couple interviews. I think it was with Regina Meredith.
That's right. I forgot. Yeah, I did
Yeah.
do. There was an interview with Sean Stone and Regina Meredith
Yes.
that was prior to the
That's it.
creation of Hollywood Decoded. Yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah, no, and they were great because I think the first one I saw, you were speaking to symbolism in myth, which
That's
I
if
thought
I
was
recall, that
fascinating,
sounds right. Yeah, yeah.
especially when I got to thinking about Brothers Grimm and a lot of the myths that I was aware of, since I was a young child. You know, this sort of thing has been going on as long as there's probably been written word, it seems, as far as symbols
Hmm.
being inserted into stories and passed on to have an impact that really, I remember reading Brothers Grimm, and those stay with you. Those were,
Hmm.
I don't know if they were always intended to instill a sense of fear or control, or if some of them really were just a way of passing on, just gentle warnings to, for the up and comers of the tribe, so to
I would say
speak.
all the above. I mean,
Yeah.
Aesop's fables, the same idea there as what you see in Grimm's fairy tales. That's really the point of the fairy tale, is to
Yeah.
have some basic moral principle or point behind it. And I would say those have always been there. But there's more than that. There's not just myths and fairy tales for moral lessons. There are also myths and fairy tales, or fables, or stories uh, that tell us esoteric truths as well, that reach into something a lot deeper. For example, a lot of people have debated the mythology of Homer, whether Homer was just describing stories of gods, or whether there are allegorical meanings behind the different characters. Whether they represent like Platonic style truths, or there's some compelling argumentation. I think it's true that the Orphic mysteries, the mysteries of Orpheus, that they actually are teaching the same truths as Platonism or Neoplatonism. So you would have at times philosophers compared to religion scholars who will go back to the myths and actually find some very interesting parallels that support the idea that even the myths can at times teach us more than just uh, moral do's and don'ts, but maybe even metaphysical principles at times.
Yes. Yes. Well, because I think so. I mean, when I've read some of the, especially going back, and even when I look at works, spiritual works, like the Bible and whatnot,
Mhm.
and I go back and I read them now, um, you start to realize that these are not just people that were sitting there just trying to find creative ways to explain concepts that were just kind of lofty, and or just like you said, just general moral principles. I got
Mhm.
the impression that it went much deeper than that, and that most works that I'm coming up, that I'm re-exploring now, that especially that I read when I was younger. um, well, actually, in your first book, what I loved at the beginning of the book, towards the beginning, is how you set the stage for how a lot of our myths really took hold on the stage, going back as far as ancient Greece, and Babylon,
Mhm.
and that is still intertwined with our theater and film and stage and Hollywood today.
Yes, I think so. I think when you look at the history of acting and the stage, you realize that obviously in the ancient world, it wasn't viewed as being separate from religion. It was viewed as, part of the incarnation, the invocation of the story, the gods themselves. So you weren't just retelling the stories of the gods; you were also kind of invoking them and trying to kind of take on their characteristics and represent the story again. And this is the same idea that you see, for example, in Orthodox Christianity, is that the liturgy is a representation of eternal truths. So it's not just a ritual, it's not just a story that's being told, it's actually believed to be a representing, a reintroduction of the reality in some degree of these events. There's of course there's an aspect of something being unclear, though, in the ancient myths of the philosophers and the Greeks as to what it means for them to be real, because most of the Greek myths are believed to have taken place during the Golden Age, right? So this is a time before time. So it was something that was going on outside of time and space in a kind of spiritual realm or an aeon or something like that. And you could get similar ideas in other religious traditions as well. But the point is that is historically in Plato's Ion. He talks to the musicians and the poets, and he's trying to argue why the philosopher is superior to the musicians and the poets. And he says it's because you guys strive to be possessed by a muse or a spirit. He's like, and so you lose the usage of the faculty of reason because you become taken over by something else. And he says that the philosopher is superior because we retain our faculties of reason and logic and so forth. So anyway, point being is that you can fast forward all the way up to the Stanislavski method, which is method acting, and that's essentially what method acting is trying to lose yourself in the character. And I would say it looks like some of the Hollywood A-listers who really go into this, they end up having mental problems, and they have some very difficult issues because they try to take on and become this other entity or person, or like Heath Ledger becoming the Joker, or I think people are saying Jim Carrey is doing this now, where he's trying to like not be Jim Carrey and become some other kind of Terrence McKenna style figure or something like that. I think all that's very dangerous. I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong to have, to be committed to method acting. It's not the problem. The problem is not acting. The problem is that when it verges on a sort of a cult practice where you actually do try to get rid of your persona, your personality. I think that's very dangerous. Anyway, but what that shows, whether you agree with me on that point or not, what it shows is that has always been, at the root of acting and theater.
I love that you went there, because that was exactly what I was going to say. Just even you touched on that so well, because that is where method acting really had its roots. And I have to say, when I first read that part of the book, and I hadn't even turned the page about method actor, the first figure that came into my mind at the time was Jared Leto, because I think it was just around that.
Yeah, that's true.
And Heath Ledger was right there too. And I turned the page, and I think that's when there was like an image of the now home of Jared Leto in Hollywood. And I thought, well, that's synchronistic. Oh, that's, because my personal feeling.
I think he still lives there. I don't know.
Oh yeah. I don't know if he's still there or at one point.
Yeah, it's the Laurel Canyon studio, right?
That's it.
Which is the old Air Force studio.
That's what I was going to say. It was kind of a secret studio for Hollywood and the military industrial complex at one point.
Exactly. Yeah. This is Dave McGowan is the first to really delve into that and expose it in his book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. And then, people have kind of piggybacked off of that and learned other things about it. And the essence of it is that, it was all the top A-listers of the 40s and 50s had access to this facility. You can dig up, actually, I dug up some footage that is declassified where Jimmy Stewart and other A-listers are just kind of hanging out, shooting military film reel stuff there, promotions for the American military and all that kind of stuff. So that's all true. So in other words, the declassified stock footage has basically vindicated everything that Dave said. So we know it's true, but yeah, that's just one very clear, very easy, and very unknown for a long time, very unknown truth about, demonstrating the point about the interplay between the arts, between theater, between Hollywood, and the establishment, between the Pentagon, the military industrial complex, and so forth.
Yeah. And the fact that you're saying it's a bit of a concern, because I know for myself, it just didn't, even just watching these films. I mean, I've been a science fiction nerd my whole life and whatnot, but there's certain films, particularly the Batman Dark Knight films, and just one example that's probably a little more recent, where I think The Crow was another one with Brandon Lee, and where I felt that there was an energy. There was something that was really invested in that film that was really intentional, and that the characters in it were more than just acting. I mean, there really did. I think anyone watching that was really watching, whether they were aware of it or not, could feel this coming through the film. And I can see why now we do see so many, like you said, especially A-list celebrities that, and I can think of others too, that really seem like they're unrecognizable by the time they've done a few of these, or, you know, at whatever point they started. They really do transform. You know, they start to really embody the energy of these characters, and it's intentional, I believe. I think a lot of us are starting to pick up on that. It's not subtle anymore. You know?
There's clips of A-list actors describing this and talking about it, and you know, talking about it almost like dissociation, like a dissociation state, like, you know. I'm trying to think if I've heard Denzel talk about that in interviews. I've heard, he's the one that comes to mind off the top of my head, but I mean, there's obviously there's others, but I think, I think Jared Leto has spoken this way.
I think Woody Harrelson, for some reason, came to my mind too. Well, Natural Born Killers. I mean, he was rumored to have been a method actor as well.
Okay.
And I know he's done some films that are, you know, over the years, he doesn't almost seem recognizable at times, or you see him come on and you start to kind of, I mean, there's almost this feeling that there's a dissociated, I mean, like there was a break. And I noticed that with Jared Leto. I just happened to notice when he was in an interview, you know, it just seemed like this person was not quite at home. I mean, the world that he was in was not his own, so to speak. Yeah, it was almost like the soul kind of checked out and something else was taking over. And
well, if you look at remember when Christian Bale was in The Machinist and how he got so skinny he looked like an AIDS victim?
Oh gosh, that's a good example.
And like Jared Leto, when he played, I think, Mark David Chapman, he got all fat and looked like a complete recluse loser. So I would say that, I mean, look at the people that they're so serious about these roles that, I mean, that they're willing to essentially inflict, you know, bodily damage to do this. But at the same time, I guess they're willing to do it too for, you know, tens of millions of dollars. So.
Well, true. And even as you had mentioned in your book, even if we go back to when this was being performed as a ritual, more or less, on the stage, I mean, people would literally sometimes die on stage. That was part, they were so, I mean, it was considered to be, you know, dying for your art was a very powerful, one of the ultimate sacrifices you could do.
Well, that's why I titled the first chapter film as Ritual, is because, you know, people don't think of movies and the arts that way, but that's the whole history and origin of the arts and of theater, is as ritual. And then when we recast it in that ancient view, I think it starts to make more sense as to how we can understand the usage of propaganda in that medium as well, mixed in with these so-called stories that are not just stories. So there are a lot of things. They're not just, you know, creative artworks at times. They're also they also might have a spiritual influence, be they good or evil, and they also can be propaganda in the sense of, as we talked about, the, you know, deep state, CIA, Pentagon, and so forth, you know, influencing the scripts, the narratives. This has been well documented now by numerous scholarly books, you know, from Operation Hollywood to CIA in Hollywood to, there's actually some more now. There's like National Security Cinema is another one of the books that deals with this. There's a whole train of books now that have come out that essentially hammer home this point of the connection between the deep state and Hollywood. But I mean, Edward Bernays, a long time ago, he said Hollywood's the greatest, you know, engine of propaganda the world's ever seen. So it's been known for a long time. It's not anything new. more recently, I've been looking into a lot of Cold War propaganda and how Hollywood really propped up and aided the Cold War. We have this idea, this mythology that there was all these communists in Hollywood.
Yes.
And we have the story of the Hollywood 10 and all that. And really that was a lot of trumped up baloney. Yeah, there were some Marxists and there were some individuals who had communist beliefs and leanings, but even at its height, at its heyday, the actual Communist Party in the U.S. only had, I think, 70,000 members max. And then a few years later, they had about 3,000. So point being is that even still, at the height of the Cold War, that wasn't a real threat. And Hollywood capitalized on this, and they actually funded way more Cold War themed, Americanist themed films than they did anything that might be castigated as so-called communist or Marxist. So the irony is that it's the other way around. And I've become more and more convinced of that as I've gotten older.
I think I have as well. Just paying attention, because I broke away from the mainstream narrative a while ago when I became aware of just how controlled it really was. And who came to mind, and I know your comedy is one of your, I would say, passions, from what I understand. And Lucille Ball, I remember, was one of the people that was on the list. Oh,
that's right. I forgot she was.
Her and Ricky Ricardo, or Desi Arnaz, I should say.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm a bit of Lucille Ball fan since I could walk. It was just someone I was just completely drawn to my entire life. I can sit there and watch a rerun of Lucy just to chill out any day. It's just it's just my little zen, and I just adore her. And I also knew that she was connected with bringing Star Trek, to TV through Desilu, when other people were maybe not as supportive of the work. And it did seem like they were doing just that, targeting these celebrities and trying to bully, essentially, the kind of bully the actors into kind of playing along or getting along at that time. And it when you look at it, it really wasn't subtle. And it really does go back that far, if not further, as you pointed out. I think a lot of the villains that have been portrayed in a lot of our, I mean, yeah. Well, and I think it's starting to come light more now.
My view is that if you look at the Cold War, you can see that the West put a lot of time and aid and effort into helping the communist regimes come to power. And this was done covertly, especially at the level of high-level banking and corporate interests. So it wasn't like everybody on the street, was sending their money to the communists and that there was this giant communist uprising in America. It was rather that it was being built up by the top globalists, who are neither capitalist nor communist. They've transcended that. Dialectics. So what was happening was they were playing the East and the West off against one another to further the ideas of globalization, to further the ideas of a one world order. And in fact, back in the 40s and 50s, the Council on Foreign Relations was already debating between their so-called right-wingers and their so-called left-wingers whether they would merge the communist East and the capitalist West in the next few decades. And so they tried to. It didn't happen as quickly as they hoped it would, but you get a whole slew of writers from the CFR guys in the 40s and 50s, all the way up through Brzezinski to the Kissingers, who basically all agree on the idea of a global order. It's just how to get that to that end goal. So the reason that relates to Hollywood and the Cold War is that there were people who believed Marxism. There were people who believed in basic ideas of communism, but the point is that they weren't the real threat. And if you look at the Reese Committee, which is I've covered this in a few videos, but this was hearings that were held by Senator Norman Dodd, where they looked into the tax exempt foundations. And what was discovered was that the top foundations like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, those were the entities that were secretly funding all of the so-called socialism and communism in America. So in other words, it was billionaire, trillionaire backers and bankers funding a faux commie socialist movement in the US to change the landscape of America and the belief and ideology of America. So when you understand that, then you realize that was the real threat. It wasn't these grubby hippies on the street, the student riot goofballs, and it wasn't a handful of idiots in Hollywood. It was really powerful, very wealthy people who had made a decision to try to go in the direction of globalization, and I've covered that in many lectures from the top globalist books. So so it's a little more. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify it just by saying like there were no Marxists or socialists. There were, but this was a movement that was not being headed out of Moscow. It was being founded and funded by the top corporations and banks in the West, and that's undisputable and undeniable. But ironically, somehow, most people don't know this. They still cannot figure this out. So that's why people will sometimes mistake. They'll hear me talk about something, and people are supremely confused, either thinking that at times they think I'm far right, and at times they think I'm a communist. So I get called both of these things, which is absurd, because it's more nuanced than that, because the world doesn't break down into these easy categories. There's actually a lot of layers and a lot of levels of stuff going on. But more and more I've become convinced that the Cold War was just as much an engineered thing as was World War I and II.
I have to agree with you. I know I followed your work, and for someone like myself, because I've been drawn into these topics for a while, and I can't say that I've always gained a lot of favoritism for these views, because unless someone's really paying attention and really hearing what you're saying or what I'm saying, it can be easy to kind of just dismiss it, through a label like, oh, well, that's oh, you must just be, there was even once where, I was just speaking about how the weaponization of gender was taking place. And I wasn't saying that, homosexuality was wrong, or that it was even just I wasn't declaring any type of judgment about, someone's sexual orientation. It was just, I was just putting forward that, through media and culture, there has also been by these same corporations and whatnot, there's a strong advantage to breaking up society and polarizing us and just getting us disassociated from our natural state of being. And, I'm also a very, I work as a professional intuitive in psychic. So, on one hand, I felt that, I think some of us are born just being a little more leaning one way, and that's fine. It's normal and natural, and whatever your sexual orientation is fine. But I also think that over here, there's this overt propaganda to get us confused, and, through many means, because just like with breaking up the family unit, we're weaker when we're confused. We're weaker when we break up the family unit, back all the way going to the World War II. I think that the even the Rand Corporation recently was in the news, or the Sony hacking was what I was thinking of, where the public suddenly, it became very public that the Hollywood was, working very closely with the Department of Defense.
Right.
And well, why is that?
Well, the next book that I'm going to do a discussion of, which touches on Hollywood a little bit, is about how the CIA was able to co-opt the Roman Catholic Church in the 20th century. And the reason this relates is because a lot of people don't know it, or they forget about it. But actually, and this is in my new book, in the first couple chapters, there were a lot of Catholic movies that came out during the Cold War, and that was because the CIA had a doctrinal warfare program where they wanted to utilize religious institutions for the purpose of furthering Americanism. So in other words, under the guise of Cold War, they were able to dupe a lot of the religious communities into basically signing on to whatever, we'll just call it the deep state because it's the same deep state today, whatever the deep state wanted to utilize these institutions for. So that was very successful. That they were completely successful in getting the Roman Catholic Church to sign on to this, and then by extension the other Protestant denominations as well. And it's very easy to document that this was spearheaded by the Rockefellers, especially particularly in America. I mean, they're the founders of this whole kind of movement of let's blend all the religions together and so forth. Anyway, the reason it relates to Rand is that if you read Alex Abea's book, and if you look at the Wim Hof book that I'm about to do a talk on, Wim Hof has a section where he discusses Walter Lippmann, and Walter Lippmann was the ad man. If I recall, he was OSS, and then a lot of his OSS buddies and CIA buddies they would form the locus of the big publishing empires, Time Life with Henry Luce, and then the early producers of like CBS, RKO Pictures, NBC, like the big networks, they were all from the OSS as well. So in other words, even the big TV networks were headed by people directly from military intelligence and the OSS, which is the predecessor to the CIA. So Lippmann is interesting though, because he was an ad man. And so he understood the relationship between psychological warfare in the battlefield and then translating that over into advertising, Wall Street, Madison Avenue type stuff. So what he does is that he says what we've got to do in America through Time Life magazine, and he's writing this back in the 40s, I think. He says we've got to essentially utilize Freudianism, utilize consumerism, and manipulate symbols to touch man's emotional centers, to transfer him away from the ideas of organic community and being connected to other people, family, et cetera, and transition them over fully into stimulus response consumers. And he was very open about that. And he talks about the manipulation of symbols to do that. And one of the easiest ways to do that is the psychoanalytical pseudoscience of Freud and, for example, mass sexualization, right? So again, sex itself is not the problem. It's the weaponization of it to mess people up so that they become essentially consumers controlled by their passions. And what's so funny to me is that Walter Lippmann, in his advice to Henry Luce at Time Magazine, was essentially telling him all this straight up. He's like, no, this is what you got to do. It's very simple. Turn them into mindless consumers. And then once you've done that, they're atomized. And once they're atomized, they can't make connections with other human beings. They won't form families. They won't have offspring. Then you've got the perfect consumer society. And simultaneous to Lippmann doing that, the Rand Corporation was doing the exact same thing. They were studying and working on how to transition America away from a production-based society in terms of their economics to a consumer and debt-based society. So what you start to see when you read all these different books, whether it's Alex Abea's book on the Rand Corporation or whether it's Wim Hof's book on the CIA and Lippmann in Time Magazine, you see the same pattern, the desire to use social engineering to transfer the culture away from certain ideas into a business phase, a mode, a period of time of consumerism, which again presupposes a lot of excess. And then we're now being told that now that we've had this long period of consumerism, which they pushed on us by design, we're now being told that we're greedy, debt-based consumers, even though we've been sold all this, go into debt, get credit cards, blah, blah, blah. Now we're being told it's time for austerity. Get your tiny house, cut everything down, stop, you're hurting Mother Earth. It's time to go into austerity. And this is what the bankers want to push with carbon taxes and all. And ultimately, it's just depopulation and putting everybody into smart cities. So point being, yes, it is absolutely weaponized and controlled. And the people who do it write books about it. That's what's so frustrating and angering to me, is that they can write all these books, they can all say it openly, put it out there, but if you talk about it, if you try to make connections between these things, you're a crazed conspiracy theorist.
Oh, yeah. And I feel you. And the reason I know what you're speaking to from my point of view has so much truth is, before I do the work, I got into the work that I'm doing now. I mean, for a couple of decades, it was essentially my job to protect corporations, major corporations. And so I got to see kind of from the inside, and it was a Freemason controlled corporation that I initially worked for the longest. And at that time, I wasn't maybe what you would consider to be someone that was awakened to a lot of these issues and things. But the longer I was there, you start to put it together. You start to realize what the corporation even is. A publicly traded corporation is. It's just a shell for a new world order. And I was a big ag underwriter, big agriculture. And so I can remember the first time I'm going out to visit these facilities and, get an inside look at, our food system. And, I could see basically fast forward almost 20 years later, this was not something that was just touching one specific industry. This is something that is deeply entrenched in all of our basic needs. It's global. And there's no heart in it. And it's about one thing and one thing only, and it's complete control. These are complete control systems. And it was funny when I was, I was probably 18, 19 years old at the time. I can remember going to see a movie with a friend of mine. I want to say it was around the time Bush Jr. Was just coming into being president. I think that's who it was that time. And I didn't consider my friend to be a conspiracy theorist or anything like that. It's just, I remember we're going to watch this film and it had to do with war, but something he said stuck with me for a long time. And he said, I've noticed something. Do you notice whenever we're getting ready for some kind of like regime change or war, that our films start to kind of give us propaganda for it?
Absolutely.
That stuck. And I thought, you're right. It really does. And then around that same time, maybe not long after, I think it was 99, I went to go see in Seattle. It was premiering. It was Eyes Wide Shut with Kubrick, and directed it. And it was his last film. And I know you've written about it and done analysis about it. But again, why that one stuck with me is even though I was not heavily well researched or aware of what the Illuminati was or what these secret societies were really all about. But I knew that when I went to see this film, although there was times where I felt it, I was a little confused. I wasn't quite sure where it was going. I could feel what I was watching was not based on fiction. And that it was, that there was some deep symbolism taking place. And then when I learned of his passing during the film, and I can remember at the time, there being some headlines about people accusing or saying that, he was probably, offed, for lack of a better word, for getting too close to the truth in that film. And I think even Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise at that time were two of those people that tried to bring that up in a roundabout or maybe a direct way. And then you didn't really hear much about it for a while after that. That movie, it didn't do great, at the box office. But that was one particular film because I also grew up not far from Bohemian Grove in Northern California, if people are aware of that little place.
Wow.
And now growing up in that area, I didn't know exactly what was happening there. I didn't actually visit the Grove. I didn't know anyone firsthand that had attended an event. I did know of a couple people that knew people that had taxied people in or out, like the prostitutes and whatnot that would go to entertain the guests. And so, what we did know, it was that it was this big Disneyland for the elite, and that whatever took place there was weird. It was,
Sure, yeah.
It was something they didn't want the public to know for sure what they're up to. But, some chalked it up to just a bunch of ex-presidents blowing off steam, to a lot of the other creepier, more, I think, true things we're hearing actually take place there, ritual abuse and all those things. So, I think even just my own personal experience, I can speak to, I think everything that you've been bringing forward is absolutely true. It's one of the reasons why I hone in so much in your work, is because I think if more people were to start taking just an observer perspective at what, what you're bringing forward, because it's all hidden in plain sight. If we could just be the observer and say, it's not about it being right or wrong, even, it's just, this is happening. This is happening.
Yeah, I mean, Bohemian Grove is definitely one of those big neocon type gatherings,
Yeah.
and you've even had previous presidents, like Nixon, talk about how degenerate it was. so,
Yeah.
so it's not hidden. It should be very well known. And then there's similar type gatherings if you're on the Democrat side. There was recent. I mean, you could look at Davos as something that's usually the global left elite, and then you could look at something like Bohemian Grove as the global neocon so-called right-wing elite. And really, it doesn't matter, because these groups are really committed to the same principles, which is just globalism.
Yeah.
And there is often that occult element, and there could be multiple reasons for that. There could be the aspect to which what I discuss in my first book is the connection between intelligence agencies and secret societies going back a long time. This goes back to the ancient world. There's books that have been written about this in terms of the Middle Ages, that modern intelligence agencies arise out of secret societies of the Middle Ages. We look to the Elizabethan era, and many of the actors were spies. We know about John Dee, who's the first 007. He's the basis for James Bond in a loose way. He was the first person to sign his signature 007 to Elizabeth, and he was her spy master, Dr. John Dee, the magician. So there's been a long connection between these two worlds. If you look at something like cryptography, cryptograms, that shows this connection as well, because the world of alchemy and the occult utilize cryptograms, and the state utilized cryptograms to send their messages. This is where computers come from the coalescing of these two worlds. So there's always been this connection, and there's the intelligence side of it, and there's also a control / mind control side to it, which I do think is real, because what cults can do to the establishment, to the super cult, is they can provide them willing dupes and patsies, people who are easily malleable and easily used, who say have been raised in some cult that was maybe controlled by a bigger group, a secret shadow group, a super cult in the background. What the lower level cults, the street level cults, can do is provide patsies and dummies and dupes for the bigger cults to use. I think that has been the case for a long time. So I think a lot of the people that might be trafficked, they might be, the human trafficking might occur through the cults that are connected to these larger groups, is what I'm trying to say. So the cults can provide the brainwashing, and that people can be funneled through the different networks. So that is real. I think that's true. That's documented in a lot of books. And so what we see at something like Bohemian Grove, or whether we look at Davos with all the liberal elite, it's all the same styles of control and the same structures of control, the same structures of power. And they're all doing the same types of nefarious deeds. But the weird part is that even the people in these groups may not even be aware of it. They're all working towards a similar goal, which is the top elite, the top technocrats are moving all of these groups and their networks towards a single goal of one world government and a one world religion. And you could look at somebody like Marilyn Ferguson, who was a fan of this. In her book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, she says it's an open conspiracy, just like H.G. Wells said. And she says that all these groups, all these networks are all going to be linked, and they all are working towards a one world government. So it's not a conspiracy. It's all, again, written of in countless books. So I'm glad you mentioned Bohemian Grove, because we often forget those kinds of things in the maelstrom of news and conspiracy. We forget like the really obvious ones. You know what I mean? And there's still people who don't even know about Bohemian Grove, and it's like,
I know
that's
what
like
you mean.
conspiracy 101.
No, I hear what you mean. And I don't know if I hadn't had some of the personal experiences I had too, that I would have been is that I would have honed in some of the things later on as I have. I know I mentioned that I worked for a Freemason controlled corporation in Seattle. And over the years that I worked there, and some of it I was much clearer in hindsight, but I really, because at first it seemed just somewhat harmless when I was in my early 20s when I started, and it was a big corporation, but it was still one that had started more or less just in the Pacific Northwest by farmers years ago, and the little Freemason group, and that is really entrenched, especially here in Washington State. And I didn't know a lot about this fraternal organization. I'll be careful naming names because I did sign some NDAs and things. But the longer I worked there, because they would also hold meetings there at the home office where I worked for this Mason group that was the board members and whatnot. And I remember that even when they would come in, it would be kind of an odd thing because some of them would almost be dressed in a ritualistic fashion. It was really bizarre. And I even had an assistant that had worked for the company for forever. I mean, she was in her late 70s, and she was high up in this fraternal organization. And at times she would drop little things about it, but then she would quickly go, oh, well, we can't talk about that. And I just remember thinking, well, that's really strange, but okay. And the longer I worked there, however, I got closer to being considered for being a higher echelon at the company, because I start to see now that they were sensing out how much they could groom you for it, that only certain people went to the fourth floor.
Absolutely. Correct.
You know what I mean? And I was very good at what I did, and I went pretty far, but I realized that I also wasn't, in their view, very controllable. And I wasn't. I mean, I had no interest really in being groomed for that.
Well, that's why, yeah, I kind of laugh when people every now and then will kind of ask, "Do you work for intelligence agencies? Are you in the CIA?" And I sit here thinking, well, if you knew about my personality profile, and tell the kind of person I am, do I seem like the kind of guy who likes to go along to get along, or do I seem like,
right,
I kind of like to be my own person? So that alone should tell you,
yeah,
because the people who, go into that kind of work, the first thing that they usually appeal to is patriotism, right? So you need to serve your country. You need to go along with this. I'm speaking of like people who are recruited into the CIA and this kind of stuff. And
yeah.
it usually begins with like patriotism. And that most people just have a naive acceptance of patriotism. Well, first of all, I don't have a naive acceptance of patriotism. If I had, I would have joined the military when my family wanted me to join the military, or portions of my family, I should say. But I never did because, well, for one, it always seemed silly to me. Like, why am I going to fight somebody else's wars? I don't know who these, billionaires are that run these corporations that want me to go fight for them. Why would I be dying? I mean, even in high school, it just seemed like, why am I going to go die for McDonald's and
Yeah.
Pepsi to set up franchises in Iraq? It just seems retarded. But that was always anathema, with certain circles of the family. So point being is that, yeah, once you figure out that signing on to this kind of stuff, what you're talking about, or, it's similar to like, it's almost like joining its own kind of cult, or it's like joining the mafia or something. If you watch The Sopranos or any mafia movie, people that join the mafia, it's like a lifetime commitment.
Exactly. And you're compromised right at the get-go. Exactly. I watched people that were getting initiated, even my own boss. I watched these people change the higher up they went. And their person, I mean, it was showing. I heard the stories of the sex occult parties that they had off on their yachts, and that did get back, and at first I just thought it was a bunch of freaky wealthy people. And I also learned that these higher echelons that were seemingly coming in and out of the company were often intertwined with the Seattle Symphony, the military, all the other big corporations in town. Everybody knew everyone. It was a good old boys club.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah. And, so it was a really good firsthand account for me to just see, what happens to people I can remember seeing this gal that started working there and then just started dating one of the guys upstairs. And before I knew it, she looked like she could barely hold it together after a while. So yeah, I
Well,
knew
a
enough
lot
to
of
know
that
I
is
wanted none
a
of
lot of that.
that. Yeah.
A lot of that is compromise and
Yeah.
seeing what people will and won't do.
Yeah.
Um,
They get you early on, and then you're
so,
owned. Yeah, that's
so I'm
it.
wondering though, like, what do you think there was an act? Because it's not always the same kinds of. Sometimes there's not an occultic element. Sometimes there might be an occultic element.
Yeah.
And not every Freemason.
Right.
Sometimes they're more atheistically minded, and they're not really serious about some sort of theology until they get up into the higher echelons where they start studying the so-called philosophy of it. But in the cases I'm just curious. In the cases you're talking about, do you think that there was an actual sort of occultic element, or was it basically just people networking and getting dirt and seeing who could move up the ladder?
I think there was an actual occult element only in that this fraternal organization, I got the impression what my assistant was trying to pass on to me was that it was almost spiritual. I mean, it was very guarded. It wasn't just networking. I mean, she was in it, you could tell, for philosophical reasons. She was a lifer, it was, and the impression I got that there was more of a Luciferian occult type influence at through this organization. They've been going a long, long, long time, for almost 100 years. Because this company had been around for that long. And now, whether or not people first got recruited were probably more, they may have just been ambitious. You know what I'm saying? They're made, but then they got compromised. I'm sure it is a tiered system still. I think many of these are. I think some do just get in thinking they're going to get ahead, and they're going to network, or it's exciting. Who knows? And then before you know it, if they can stick it out that long, the further in they get brought in, then I think that's when you start to see their real true colors at the top. Because I know that even when I left the company, because I've been there so long, and I was really well respected by the higher echelons, but I was also known to be a bit of a rebel rouser. And when I left, I was one of the few people that ever had an exit interview with the CEO of the company. Like, oh, she's leaving. We'll better talk to her, see what she knows. Or, is she pissed off or what? What's she going to do? And even to this day, I'm sure they may even keep an eye on me. I don't know. But then again, yeah, I do think there, I think throughout many of these, if you, like you were pointing out, if you go up high enough and they're tiered, when you get to the people that are really at the top of things, I do think there's that occult influence in a strong way. And actually, you were touching on your second book, and I really want to give you a chance to speak more about that too, because I'm excited. I cannot wait, because I devoured your first book, and you're saying that this second book's going to have a slightly different tone to it, or?
Well, a lot of the essays that I wrote in the first book were written kind of a long time ago, and so most of them are good, but that wasn't necessarily my best writing. I feel like the writing got better over the years. So the second book will be, I think, a little more mature in terms of the actual writing itself. There won't be sidebars like there were in the first book, which I think was helpful. A lot of people said they didn't know all these words I was talking about. Well, that's why I went and had to put 60 freaking extra paragraphs in the book to help you learn these words. So anyway, point being is that the second book is going to be more, it's going to start kind of with more basic stuff in terms of the mafia and terror, and how the mob and terror have been presented in Hollywood, and how it relates to the Cold War and dialectics. So that's going to be the first several chapters of the book, and I touch on The Godfather, and I touch on Aviator, and I touch on the Cold War, I touch on mobs, and everybody knows this has happened in Hollywood, but
Yeah.
I felt like that was an element that was, missing in the first one. But I was limited in what I could put in terms of space wise into the first book, and I hope that if it sold well enough, there would be a second one. So I'll be able to expand into that kind of stuff and tie a lot of things together that people didn't know about the interconnectedness there. I specifically go into what you were talking about with like how Hollywood prepared us for the war on terror before the war on terror actually came on the scene. So I do touch on that, and then I move into the second section is a little more like the first book, where I talk about esoteric and occult things in Hollywood, and specifically kind of like satanic or occultic movements as they relate to Hollywood and films. And then the next section moves to a little bit on weather modification and geoengineering and how that's been presented in film.
Yeah.
As well as mind control, MK Ultra in film. And then the final section, it moves to transhumanism in film. So the style of the book will be the same in terms of the essays, but it's like the first book was organized kind of by directors, right? So there's like Kubrick, and then Spielberg and Hitchcock and David Lynch, and the next book is more thematic. It's themes rather than directors.
That's great. Well, you mentioned the mafia, and I know that crime syndicates, if we even refer to them as that, are a huge part of the New World Order structure.
Right.
And even, I grew up in an area where gangs were an extension of the mafia. A lot of people don't know that a lot of the gangs that we've seen, especially coming through the 80s, the movie Colors and all of that was a big part of mafia. It was just an extension. And I, like a lot of other people, with those movies, the mafia movies, I binged watched The Sopranos. I remember when it first came about. And there was just this feel of, you start to realize that these things are deeply connected.
They are, yeah. And a lot of people don't know that even the street gangs, have had longtime connections, not just to bigger level mafia organizations, but to the CIA. The CIA has had deals, FBI has had deals with, certain street gangs, against other street gangs. Right? So,
yeah, and it was major propaganda too, because I remember junior high school, at that point you couldn't wear certain colors to school because it wasn't safe. You'd get
Crips and the blood and all that.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
A lot of people have talked about, like Freeway, Ricky Ross has talked about how he was selling drugs for all these years and didn't realize that it was for the CIA. so yeah, they did have a plan to import crack, to the ghetto. I think nowadays that's been upgraded to meth to the Southerners, to the rednecks. So the blacks got the crack, and we white rednecks got the meth, and the blacks and the whites hate each other, and they're too stupid to realize that it's there's a group above that that manipulates that and hates them both. So
yeah, the beauty of compartmentalization, that the top tier always thinks they're the top dog and don't know what. Yeah, exactly, at the top of the pyramid. And and now we know why control systems are so alive and well. Because the movie Fight Club, I remember, came out, I think around the time. I even actually saw the author do a reading that wrote that book from Fight Club not long after it was released. And that was a film that I felt was, again, another good example of something that was preparing us.
Oh, absolutely.
For, because, especially with the ending of the film, you had the.
Very 9/11,
yeah. Yeah. And it was about creating chaos, civil disobedience, trying to program us on how to respond to these events, in a very calculated way. In hindsight, and I think being the age we were at the time that these films were coming out, and then being of age when 9/11 happened, we get a much clearer picture, that hindsight is helpful. Whereas maybe some of the younger folks, that might be difficult for them to kind of get a hold of, but they've been grooming us for such a long time. And I'm excited for your new book, because it sounds like it's just going to take us to the next level. Your first book, I think, was exceptional, and you're a wordsmith, but I think that only speaks to your intelligence and just how well you're able to synthesize all this information. And it's a lot. It's a lot. I mean, you think of hundreds of years. I mean, where do you start, right? Like I said, one of the first questions I was going to ask you is, so when do you sleep? Because your work is so prolific. I know I've only probably even touched on a fraction of what you've done since you started doing, this meta-analysis.
There's hundreds of essays. There could, I've already written basically the equivalent of multiple books. So there's enough material to have 4 or 5 books printed already.
Yeah.
So a lot of essays, and then a lot of audios, and now a lot of videos. So there is a lot of material, and I mean, thank you. I hope that hopefully I can continue to keep putting it out. I mean, that's kind of why I've really enjoyed doing it full time, is that it allows me to do it, to have a much greater output. So eventually, I'd like to not just have books that do Hollywood, but I'd like to eventually have a geopolitics, philosophy of globalism book. I'd like to take all this material that I read for the Globalist book series lectures that I've done, and really boil that down into a book on that, on the philosophy of globalism, or something like that. I have to figure out a catchier title, but so hopefully I can eventually move into a book on that, and then maybe if Esoteric Hollywood 2 sells well, go on and have Esoteric Hollywood 3. A trilogy would be ideal, but if it keeps selling, I'll keep writing Esoteric Hollywood books as long as they sell. But anyway, I think it's also a learning process for me. So every day I learn new things. So it's whether it's theology, whether it's history, whether it's geopolitics, whether it's philosophy or movies, there's always new rabbit holes to go down, and I don't ever really get tired of going down the rabbit holes. So but the big ones are when you start to notice the connections between these different seemingly disparate worlds, and then when you start to realize other angles, like the importance of understanding the mob angle, the importance of understanding how drug trafficking works internationally. That's a big puzzle piece that a lot of people don't know about.
Yes.
When you start to understand that kind of stuff, when you understand the motivations of the 20th century and its wars, from Quigley, those are really, big puzzle pieces to figuring a lot of this stuff out. Then you start to see the world in a new way. And actually, again, one of the reasons I wrote a lot on movies was to have a way to connect with people, because people watch movies, but they're not going to read any of these books that I talk about. I mean, a very small fraction of the people out there are going to actually read any of the books that I talk about. So how do I convey that information? Well, I have to use something that is a medium, and movies, at least for me, happens to be one of the easiest ways to do. Other people have some good podcasts, where they talk about this kind of stuff in music, like Aaron Franz and his podcast, where he talks about transhumanism and music and that kind of stuff. So I just try to do a similar thing. And Dave McGowan tries to do the same thing with his analysis of the music industry, and I do a similar thing with film.
And you do it exceptionally. You really do. I was just going to say, I know that you also come under a lot of, and I'm sorry if I'm keeping you over, if you have a few more minutes. It was just that I know that you've faced social media censorship, and have, like a lot of folks that are trying to put these powerful messages out there that are against, let's say, the mainstream narrative. Mm-hmm. How have you been dealing with that? Because I know myself, I started this series because I've had contact with a lot of insiders and whatnot that, like yourself, for me, science fiction was a medium that with the subjects I've been more directly involved with more recently, like the secret space programs, ufology, consciousness, and kind of the hijacking of all that, I thought it'd be great to get people that really know, from an insider's perspective, or like yourself, that just been, this has been their life's work, to have them come and speak to the relationships in these mediums, these films, and how it pertains to their real life experiences or their work. So I'm just kind of wondering, have you been contending with that? Because I definitely want to be one of those people that helps break that red tape for people like you too.
Well, because me and my colleagues and people I do shows with, we knew a lot of the censorship was coming. We did Boiler Room episodes from the beginning 3 years ago, talking about how they would roll out the social media censorship. So we knew that all along. So we kind of had a lot of backup plans of preparation for when that came, and it did come and has come, and I'm sure there will be more censorship. So, all you can do is what you can do. All you can do is, continue to do what you can with the means that you have. So, so far, thank God, been able to continue going. But, it just depends on, I think the bigger that you get, the more eyes are on you, the more dangerous it is. So there's a little bit of a blessing and a curse in terms of gaining an audience. So, if your YouTube channel starts getting up into the 2, 3, 500,000 category, you're much more likely to get targeted and shut down. So I don't, what can you do? There's nothing else.
Persevere.
Continue it. I'm going to continue doing this, until I'm like banned from the internet or something, I guess. I don't know if that's going to happen, but.
Well, I was going to ask that, just, what motivates you,
down the road, they will implement some kind of like banning you from commerce and the internet is what they'll eventually do. Bertrand Russell said 100 years ago, that's what they do. So.
And it could be, I've even faced, I'm not what I consider to be a big figure, prolific figure by any means. And even I have faced some interesting censorship about certain topics that I know what you're saying. And that the grassroots.
Actually, it's not going to be based on how big you are. It's just going to be based on like AI and algorithms are going to.
That's true. That's true. I've noticed that, because if you do an appeal, you're not talking to there's no human being on the other end of no. You're absolutely right. And if anything, I imagine that it's always going to kind of boil back down to grassroots platforms and movements that are going to be our most resilient way of pushing back. Because obviously once something gets big enough, they'll either get messed with till the corporations can buy them out, and they can't afford to if they're willing to go there, or they'll just try and cause chaos to where it just makes it very difficult for them to continue. If there's someone they're that concerned about. So that's why I'm so grateful that you do have your own platform going with, and diversifying, so more and more people get your voice out there, because it's something that I think will grow, because I think you've only hit the tip of the iceberg. And yet, even with all that you've accomplished, I know there's so much more powerful meta-analysis that you're going to be putting forward that I think everyone needs to hear or should hear.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you for that.
I think I'm trying to speak positive things about very complex, difficult topics in a digestible way. At least that's the goal.
And you can tell someone what's motivating you is not, clearly this is something, these topics are your work is something you're very passionate about. It's not for vanity. It's not for just getting a name. You're clearly doing work that no one in their right mind, you know what I'm saying? It would invest that much.
For example, I wouldn't be a critic of Darwinism if I was just wanting to make a name. That's kind of like one of the most hallowed dogmas of modernity. And I don't believe it. So, right away, that's something that is like an easy throwaway for most people. Oh, he doesn't even believe Darwinism. So, we don't even have to listen to him. So, but that's how I am. I'm not going to compromise on that, because I
Yeah.
see that as central, as key, in one of the most important dogmas of modernity in terms of dehumanizing people is Darwinism. So nothing is going to change in anybody's worldview or systems until we're at least willing to think outside the box on that one. And I would say that once you realize that the Darwinian ethos is not so much based on empirical science, but on rather mythology and grand narrative assumptions, then you start to realize that this is actually a myth. It's actually a story that's being told. Has hardly anything to do with actual empirical science and data. It's a very grandiose, very elaborate interpretation and mythologizing of data, right? And so it operates on all these assumptions that scientism operates on. And once you understand that scientism is really a philosophical presupposition and kind of a pre-programmed thing that we are told in modernity and in the education system, most people don't think to do this. They don't question presuppositions. They don't question their paradigm. They don't question something like scientism. And that's why it's very easy to break it down. It collapses very easily and very quickly under about 5 minutes of philosophical interrogation. And so, once you do that, if you're willing to do that, it really opens up new paradigms. It opens up new ways of viewing the world and looking at things that you're never going to be able to do or see when you're locked in the scientism paradox, or excuse me, the scientism box. It's not even a paradox, because scientism is actually an outright contradiction, and that's not fair to a paradox, because a paradox in logic isn't even a contradiction.
Well, that's it. And I think you nailed it earlier on when you honed in on the fact that, many of us have not been groomed to think outside the box, or to are very ignorant. I mean, there's just no better word to put it. We're very ignorant to because of our grooming through these institutions from the time we're born, to even know how to feel safe, even thinking outside the box. We're very used to having things thought for us. So we don't, and admittedly, we're kept in a state of chaos and survival mode most of the time, and to be very polarized. So we don't have the time or energy to invest in, or feeling well enough, like we were saying, with the hijacking a lot of our basic needs early on, it is going to take a lot of our own, being our own advocate, being the rebel, being the free thinker, to seek out,
yeah, I think it's some of the Tavistock, if I recall, documents that talked about the usefulness of keeping people in a constantly fearful, agitated state. And this is actually one of the key roles of the news media. And even the local news is designed in this kind of psychological warfare trap, where I've talked about this many times, but the actual pattern of what you see in a local news broadcast is like your local Channel 4 news or whatever. That it actually is designed in a very scientific, specific way to give you kind of an up and down roller coaster ride, where you're hearing about terror and people getting their heads ripped off, and then you hear about kitties. I'm serious. It's actually designed to take you on this emotional roller coaster ride, and you don't get anything useful out of it. It's really just a conditioning mechanism. It's another version of the sort of stimulus response that Lippmann talked about, and that the behaviorists and B.F. Skinner talked about. Pavlov. That's another example too, by the way, that shows you that there wasn't a real difference between Eastern atheistic communism and Western atheistic capitalism, is that both systems were founded on materialistic behaviorist psychology. For example, in Eastern communism, you had Pavlov, right? The ideological modus operandi for the psychology of the Soviets was Pavlov, and the analog in America was the Rockefeller-funded B.F. Skinner and J.B. Watson. And all parties, East or West, they denied the soul. They denied anything spiritual or metaphysical. They only viewed man as kind of an animal conditioned by stimulus response. So once again, the psychology, the anthropology of atheistic capitalism and atheistic communism are exactly the same. Man is a being to be trained by his environment. And if you say, well, so what? Why is this? Well, let's look at the ideology of somebody who has that view. Take Skinner. Skinner put his daughter in a box. He would put her in a box to condition her. So here's the mind control mad scientist freaks that are the ideologues of America and the Soviets. Pavlov, they're maniacs, right? We're talking about, Alfred Kinsey, funded by the Rockefellers. He can go and molest hundreds of kids, but it's for the good of science. So these are madmen, they're freaks, they're lunatics. And we're supposed to believe, though, that it's all for progress, it's all for science and all that. So science and progress are the two of the biggest idols and myths that need to fall. Now, I'm all for science, by the way. One of the things I focused on in undergrad and grad school was philosophy of science. So I'm not at all anti-science or irrational. This is another mistake people fall into when they hear the stuff I talk about. They'll either think that if I talk about something like philosophy of science or scientism, it's way too rational, or I'm being too logical. And then at other times they'll hear me talk about something else and they go, oh, he's irrational, he doesn't believe in science, which is just ridiculous. But yeah, I mean, life is nuanced, life is complex. But anyway, point being, you have to question scientism, because that's probably the biggest global dogma of our day. I mean, I don't think,
absolutely.
almost everybody believes that there's this thing called science, and that is what has, quote, saved the world somehow. And if you start thinking about it, that's actually really absurd, because as my good friend Chris pointed out a long time ago, science is nothing more than a tool. It's just a way of investigating the natural world. And so to exalt a tool into somehow thinking that tool itself is a grand mythological narrative, which scientism does, is laughable. It's like saying screwdriver. The screwdriver is God because the screwdriver gave us everything. No, it's just a tool. I mean, and it's a tool just like the scientific method is a tool.
Exactly, and it can be wielded depending on the wielder, a million different directions.
Right,
Exactly. I thought of War of the Worlds, going back to radio. Wasn't that an interesting experiment? Even before the television. Let's see how people react. Let's see what happens when we tell them there's an alien invasion and they think it's real.
A Rockefeller-funded psychological warfare study.
Yeah. So I mean, you can see there's just been all these little, looking back, they've been testing the waters with us for as long as these concepts could exist, or things, tools could be controlled. I guess that's the thing. There's always been this duality where, that we're trying to kind of elevate, transcend ourselves from, to where we all just kind of become more this empowered, where we as beings become just more of the seeker, and more of the, that we become our own gurus, that we become our own scientists, and that if things were more balanced, we wouldn't be, if we could get to a place where we, basically overhauled how we educate ourselves and how we relate to each other, it would be much more difficult for these types of agendas to be executed, and I think that we'll get there. I mean, I do think it's part of our learning curve, so to speak, but that's again why I think your work is so powerful, and why we need to be having more of these conversations, as opposed to being so quick to turn off something just because it's not falling in alignment with what we've been told in school, or just because we're just too exhausted to maybe consider there's some truth to these things, because that might actually mean that we need to take some action. We might actually need to do something, do something differently. And that overwhelms some folks, I realize. And, and I have some friends too that, they kind of immediately go into that state of denial, because I think it's just so difficult at first when that seed's planted. It is almost going through the stages of grief. We're like, oh God, that just couldn't be so.
Yeah,
And then
we were just talking about this on a different show where, you kind of go through these processes of, being confronted with this information, and at first you want to deny it, and then you have to accept it, and then you're shocked, and then you're depressed, and then you get over it, and you are stronger for it.
that's it. It means I call it seed planting, and I think it's a power. We're basically it's what they've been using unbeknownst to us for this the elite or the New World Order. They've been planting seeds, but that goes both ways. The more that we're able to have these conversations, the seeds are planted, and you can't undo those things.
That's
And
true.
it does have a powerful ripple effect. That's why I try to have a lot of patience with folks if they, their knee-jerk reaction is just to tell me to go stick it, or they just have to turn me off, and that's fine. But the seed's there.
Yeah.
And
Well,
if
it's definitely true that, when stuff comes true, 10 years after you talked about it, and people called you crazy for 10 years. But sadly, quite often, you don't get the respect that you ought to get when you've talked about stuff for 10 years.
Yeah.
So, but that's just how it is with humans. And
it can be. And I guess that's why it does come back to, and one of the questions I had for you is, what, after all you've been through, what continues to motivate you to invest so much in your work? How would you answer that?
well, the ultimate motivation is that I believe in God. I want to do what is correct in terms of my worldview.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I do this because I enjoy doing it, and I enjoy being my own boss. I don't like being a wage slave. I don't like working for other people. I like directing my own projects, creating my own material. And let me think. Yeah, I guess that's the main two motivators there. I was doing the same types of stuff though, even before, back when I was a wage slave, back when I was in school. So I was blogging, I was talking about all the same stuff. So it's not that hasn't changed. It's just that the what changes is the way that you have to relate to people, and how you spend your time. So I don't really have much free time anymore. Most of my time, goes to doing this, because there's pros and cons either way. When you have a boss, there's a freedom that you get in terms of, when you're off the clock, you're off the clock. You don't have to worry about it. If you're your own boss, if you pay your own taxes and all that, it's all on you. So you basically don't get time off.
Oh,
Which I'm not bitching. I'm just saying, that is a motivator, is that you have to do it all the time. Every day that you don't, produce material is an audience that you're losing. So anyway,
you had to have been hardwired for it. In other words, definitely. And I feel you. The last 7 years have been in a similar boat, just where I have a lot of respect for people that take the step. I understand. I'm not saying I don't have respect for people that have to work for someone else or anything like that. It's just, some people just don't appreciate, there is no clocking out. I'm just going to leave it there. It's your baby. It really, if you're especially when you're so passionate about what you're doing, you're so invested because it's a part of you that you're really giving. And I get that, and that does come through in your work. And I was also just gonna ask you a little bit, if you don't mind. And again, I'm trying to watch a clock, because I don't want to. You're a busy person, and I don't want to infringe on your time. And I'm so grateful just to have you on today. Comedy, that is now, you clearly have a great sense of humor, and but with comedy, how did you kind of come into comedy? Are you doing comedy in addition to all this professionally, or is it a hobby, or do you have certain influence
I wanted to be a stand-up originally, so that's awesome. Was the whole point of what I was going to do. And then I did some stand-up when I was 18, 19, and I was really turned off by the whole club scene. That was prior to the internet, so that was like 97, 98, and the only way to to do comedy was to be a stand-up, club comedian. And I'm not knocking that. I have respect for people that are able to do that, because it's very, very grueling, very difficult. But I just felt like it wasn't going to be a rewarding path. It had nothing to do with like my comedy being shitty. In fact, it was generally the people that own the clubs and whatnot, they would let me host. They thought it was good material. So it wasn't that it was bad. It was just that I just felt like I can either put 10 years into trying to, go around clubs and do this kind of stuff, or I could go to the university and get a degree. So I opted for going and studying philosophy. So it's not like I quit or did, it's just that I didn't. And then the internet kind of made it a lot easier, to kind of meld all these worlds, you know what I mean? So you don't have to be oh, you're the guy that talks about XYZ. It's a weird mix where you can kind of be the person that you are.
Yeah.
And simultaneously wear all these different hats. So I've always liked comedy. I always wanted to be a comedian. Originally, that's what I was going to do. I didn't really care about any of this stuff until about 18, but I mean, I think most people age 18, 19, 20, they start asking more. They ask deeper questions, what's the point of life? Why am I here? Maybe it's not just to be famous, or it has a purpose. So, the full circle weirdness is that, the way I view it is that I've already got an audience larger than most of the people that I knew who were doing stand-up a long time ago. Like the guys who chose, like I know a guy who's a fairly well-known stand-up right now, and he went the route of the clubs, and it took him 10, 12, 15 years to get on Letterman, to be on with Seth Meyers, and he's not his own boss. He has, it's tightly controlled what he can and can't say.
I was just going to say, a lot of censorship with comedy now, and control.
So I decided I'm not going that route. I'm not going to do it that way. If I ever, I can do what I do now and still act ridiculous and import my own comedic side. And, that I'm not bragging, but I'm just saying that I think I made the right choice. I mean, I've got, my audience is, almost 5 or 10 times that guy's audience. And he's a, well-paid traveling stand-up. So, we have to make tough choices in life. It wasn't easy choosing, to not do stand-up, but to focus on school. But in the long run, I made the right decision.
I'd say so. And like you said, with the gift of the way time had changed, like you said, you being able to intertwine the two, and there's a lot less, you can blur the lines now. I used to joke that if I wasn't going to be a professional sidekick, I was just going to go be a stand-up comedian, because I've always been really, but the same reason I was very off-put though by it at the same time for years because of what you spoke to. And now looking at a lot of the famous comedians, you can tell that they've had to compromise a lot.
Well, Jerry Seinfeld bitches about it all the time.
Yeah.
He says comedy's dead because of political correctness. So there you go.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. I watch his comedian cars getting coffee and different things. Cause I even the control, even if I know they're controlled, I still watch because there is a mastery at hand there. And there's often those truths they're there, and, I think that's one of the reasons, again, I was drawn to your work is because your innate wiring for using humor to bring forward really difficult, sometimes painful and really dark concepts. It's very helpful, and I think that's why I've loved comedy as a medium for my entire life. Before science fiction, even comedy was it for me, because it could speak to very difficult things and yet engage so many people at the same time in a way that they could still walk away smiling. It was really something else. Like, I thought
the establishment
channelers,
The establishment knows that too. And that's why they've used comedy for a long time for propaganda. I mean, I've talked about this so many times. Stripes with Bill Murray. That's a recruitment film.
Yes. I was even thinking of the fraternity movies, Animal House, the sororities that were coming out for a long time, trying to kind of because when you look at what sororities and fraternities really are, which aren't really all that funny, or
secret society masonry stuff.
Yeah. If you start looking at those things, you can see, and that's why I think it was always off-putting when certain comedians would go and do all of a sudden a very serious role.
Mm-hmm.
It was almost a little too disturbing, like to see Robin Williams actually go and do a dark role. It was too good. You could tell he was tapping into something that was just too real within him. And that's why I think, like you're saying, I think a lot of the people we're seeing coming out now is being compromised. Unfortunately, a lot of them are comedians. And
comedy is a culture driver. So it, just like everything else, it has to be controlled. Just like food is a part of culture. It has to be controlled.
Huge.
Comedy, the arts, all of it.
And I'm glad you speak to those things too. I mean, if you follow Jay's work, I mean, your recent interview with Primal Edge, sorry, I thought that was excellent. Because again, it's for me, I don't really care which way people lean to as far as what foods they want to do, as long as it's nourishing to them, I mean, it's a big part of what I'm about. I really like people to get more in touch with nature and what nourishes them and, what is natural for us. But I do think there's been a huge push to weaponize how we eat. And that's been done through different diets, being the panacea for everything. If you go vegan, all your issues will disappear. If you go this way, that's been going on a long time. And yeah, so I mean, everyone watching, if you go and check out his YouTube channel and whatnot, he speaks to a lot of these topics that are very relevant to how many of our systems have been weaponized. And it's not about making someone wrong or right because they like this particular food or whatnot. It's just about that awareness that this is happening. And without that awareness, we really do just continue to be, I know it sounds derogatory, but sheep, we just mindless consumerism. And it really is up to us to bring forward any type of sustainable change by just being willing to just call it out, just to see it, just to see it for what it is.
Right.
And then we can make more informed decisions, if nothing else. So thank you. Yeah, I wanted to mention that because, a lot of my work is around holistic living and trying to get people more imbalanced with who they are and from a holistic perspective.
Right.
Everything from the media you consume to what you put in your bodies to what you do spiritually. To me, compartmentalization doesn't work to make you a whole being to really thrive.
Right. Exactly.
You got to look at all of it. It's just,
Cool. Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's been a great talk.
Thank you. And just real quick again, where they can find you.
I do jaysanalysis.com, and you can subscribe to my stuff there. And there's a lot of talks, lectures, interviews, kind of like this, going back 2 or 3, 4 years in the archives. And then you can get signed copies of my book at the website, at the shop. So I sell signed copies of my book as an advantage over just getting it on Amazon. And the TV show is Hollywood Decoded, which there's a link for that at the website to Gaia, where you can watch our TV show. And I think that's the main stuff, except for the second book will be out in December. So if you like the first book, definitely get part 2 from the website as well. And
this one.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And the next one will be even bigger, so it's even fatter. It's over 4. I think it's 404 pages. So.
Well, I'm excited. I'm definitely got a copy coming, and I just want to tell you again, thank you so much, Jay. I'm going to continue to put your work out there as much as I can. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you.
Just, you're awesome. Thank you.
Well, thank you. You're awesome. And I hope you have a good day, and we'll talk soon.
You bet. Take care.
Later.